All right. Are we good for the virtual? Perfect. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Lori Harder. I lead our social impact efforts at Alteryx, which is a data analytics company, and I'm also on the BCivic Summit Committee. So it is my honor to thank you all for joining us in this session today, Leadership in Climate Action with Climate Targets. And we have three fabulous speakers today. So as the Director of ESG, Samantha has focused on developing and executing Prologis Net Zero by 2040 commitment to be achieved by implementing renewable energy, eliminating fuel use, and implementing low carbon construction practices across Prologis 1B square foot industrial real estate portfolio. Previously, Samantha was Sustainability, Manufacturing, and Supply Chain Strategist at Accenture, focused on the consumer product and engineering industries. You want to raise your hand? Perfect. And then we have Nina, who is the Global Sustainability Manager at Ball Corp, a global leader in sustainable aluminum packaging solutions and aerospace technologies and services. Nina partners with internal and external stakeholders to continuously enhance the sustainability credentials of aluminum packaging and drive long-term value creation. Nina's current focus areas include developing and managing the company's sustainable data strategy, supporting achievements towards their 2030 sustainable goals, including their science-based targets, and developing their water stewardship program. And then Phil is a principal consultant at South Pole Agricultural Value Chains team. He has a decade of experience in assisting enterprises with their climate change strategy across apparel, retail, food and beverage, technology, financial services sectors. He has worked extensively on measuring and developing mitigation strategies at the value chain level and has also supported initiatives expanding financial and certification standards for regenerative farming. Phil. And as a reminder, all of these workshops are being recorded and all of the resources mentioned will be available after the summit. We will have questions after the presentation. And for those of you who are virtual, we encourage you to post your comments in the chat as well. And with that, I am excited to pass it over to Phil.
So, all right. Have not spent a whole lot of time in front of a microphone or listening to my own voice, so that's always a fun experience. Thank you, Lori, for the introductions. I'm going to walk through a brief overview of carbon accounting methodology principles, as well as target setting frameworks. And then we'll dive into a couple examples with the other panelists. So first, I did want to get started just with a very quick poll. I'm hoping to get some audience participation here just to understand really the level of experience that folks in the room have with these topics, and we can sort of identify where it's most useful to spend some time. So if I could ask, how many of the folks in the room have either measured or estimated scope 1 and 2 emissions or helped other organizations with that process? That would be great. Thank you. What about scope 3? Right. And how many of you have investigated some sort of reduction target for your organization? Okay, starting to thin out a little bit here. So any that have actually set a reduction target? Great. Fantastic. I'm going to go ahead and skip the last couple. I think that we've gotten what we needed there. So thank you all. Excellent. So starting, I think, just at a really high level with carbon accounting principles. So, the first step for an organization is to understand its footprint. This is a very sort of traditional and widely used graphic that was shared or created and shared by WRI as part of the GHG protocol. It divides all GHG emission sources that an organization might see as part of its overall value chain or its sort of product and service offering into 3 different scopes. So in the middle there, you see scope 1. this is, I like to think of Scope 1 emissions as if you were to put a sort of plastic bubble around all of the facilities or vehicles that your company is operating, and you capture all the various greenhouse gas emissions, be it carbon dioxide, be it methane, nitrous oxide, those would be your Scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 is sort of a unique and special category in that it's associated just with purchased energy and the emissions that are associated with generating the energy that your facilities use. And then Scope 3 would be, for many organizations, the biggest category, but also the ones that are most difficult to influence. So that spans up and down the value chain. If you look sort of upstream of a business, you're looking at your supply chain emissions. You're looking at things like product transport, if that's relevant to your company. Business travel, so that's technically upstream because it's something that you're procuring and therefore sort of sits in that group. Downstream, you're looking at everything that goes all the way down to customer use of your product. So if it actually requires energy to use, or if there are emissions associated with the use of that product or service, then that's where that would sit. And even things like waste. So, you know, lots of categories here. My one sort of qualm with this graph is that for many organizations, the purchased goods and services category is a huge percentage of their emissions. And, you know, in this chart, you can see sort of just sitting in the bottom left corner there. So with that in mind, I just wanted to do sort of a quick high-level overview at what the actual footprint across Scope 1, 2, and 3 looks like for organizations across a variety of industries. So here you have Scope 1 and 2 emissions highlighted in the green. You have those supply chain emissions in gray. And then the purple would be product use phase. So that's essentially the actual use of what's being sold. And then the sort of, I don't know, I guess I'd call that lavender, would be investments. And then orange is all other Scope 3 categories. So you can see that, you know, the sort of breakdown of Scope 1, 2, and 3 varies quite a bit, but also within Scope 3, the breakdown of which category is most relevant to your business, and therefore where, you know, you may actually want to engage your suppliers or potentially your product design team on reducing emissions associated with the use of a product. Just to give another example, you know, that really depends on the sector that you're in. Great. So for those curious to learn a little bit more about the steps associated with conducting a GHG inventory, so at South Pole, we advise a number of clients on this process. And for those that haven't done it before, you know, the first step is really to define the boundaries, and that will sort of dictate what you're actually deeming to be part of your Scope 1 and 2 emissions. There's a couple different approaches to this. Some companies use a financial approach of, you know, what assets they control. Others use more of an operational approach in terms of what they're actually operating, or what types of sort of vehicles and facilities their employees are sort of using on a day-to-day basis. Next, you'll go into data collection. This is, of course, pretty iterative in that the first year you might use quite a bit of high-level data and estimates in order to do this process, and I'll go into a couple examples of that in a second. Following that, you'll have to actually apply that data to emissions factors and global warming potentials in order to quantify GHG emissions. This is often where a number of companies will go out and seek support from third parties. Obviously, you don't need to. There are some, you know, various tools that are available that can help with this process, but you know, it sort of depends on the complexity of the organization. And then finally, we get into reporting. You know, why are we doing this? Often it's to communicate our climate footprint, and there are various standards like CDP and GRI that sort of dictate what should be reported and what level of granularity you want to look at. And then, of course, down at the bottom, I've got third-party validation down there. That's something that may or may not be required for your organization, depending on stakeholder expectations. So a quick sort of deep dive into some of the nuances around carbon accounting. up at the top there, I've got a couple sort of considerations around data quality. Again, it's common for organizations to maybe take a first pass at this exercise and use pretty high level data, especially if it's difficult to get more detailed primary data, and to really identify what the largest emission sources are that should then sort of dictate where they should invest their time to get a higher quality of data to drive calculations. So, secondary data would be things like using square footage to approximate energy use or using just spend data to approximate energy use. And then if you identify that that is indeed, a significant priority for your business, then you'll know that, going down to the sort of metering of actual energy consumption is necessary. Similarly, going down to the emissions factors piece. So scope 2, again, this is where scope 2 is a little bit unique in that there are a couple different approaches to quantifying emissions associated with that. There's a market-based as well as a location-based approach. Those are essentially what they sound. The market-based approach depends on the specific contract you have with the utility provider, but this also allows you to invest in things like renewable energy certificates, where you can demonstrate reduced impact associated with your electricity use based on procuring green energy through either your utility or through sort of a separate vendor. Location-based is just a sort of wide average, right, for your region. So in scope 2 is unique again because you are asked to report both of these. When you think about things like scope 3 and the emissions associated with that, you might start out by using sort of a regional average associated with your suppliers or associated with commodities that you're procuring to make the products that you're selling. And then as you get sort of more in the weeds and more mature, you might actually reach out to those suppliers to try to understand specific practices that they're enacting and how that might impact the emissions associated with the exact goods that they're selling to you, right? So that would sort of be that vendor-specific emissions factor that you'd eventually be building up toward. Again, a lot of organizations are not quite there yet. A lot still do use sort of more generic factors. But yeah, just a couple examples there. Great. So moving into the target setting world, wanted to give sort of a brief background to this. In 2015, numerous nations came together and agreed to reduce emissions as part of the Paris Agreement. Just a couple years later, the sort of parameters around that agreement were updated by the IPCC, and that namely that we needed to reduce emissions faster than we sort of previously had thought. So this sort of laid the foundation for the Science-Based Targets framework, in that it really highlighted that emissions needed to be reduced significantly by 2030, and then that we should try and target sort of almost a zero emissions scenario by 2050. And so with that, the Science-Based Targets Initiative came together and really started translating that sort of higher level consensus into a roadmap for businesses and other organizations. Really the keys here being that companies should seek to set extremely ambitious targets for those emissions that they have direct control over, and still very ambitious targets for their scope 3. I'm going to go ahead and skip forward since I think I've only got a few minutes left. In looking at the target setting approach, there are a couple different types of targets that companies consider typically. Those include absolute as well as intensity targets. Absolute would be a commitment that your organization will simply reduce emissions by, let's say, 30% by 2030, regardless of what happens in terms of growth or other sort of changing parameters within the business. An intensity target is typically expressed on sort of like a per dollar revenue or per unit of production. So in theory, it sort of accommodates some of the growth that that your business might be undergoing. I will say the Science-Based Targets Initiative and framework is pretty intelligent, pretty sophisticated, and it sort of takes into account the growth that businesses are projecting. And therefore, they will require companies that are setting an intensity-based target to set a much more ambitious target on sort of a percent basis than they would an absolute target. So, you know, I would say this is definitely a scenario where there's sort of no free lunch, and companies are asked to set ambitious targets either way. Here's sort of a high-level visualization of what is meant by a net zero target. That sort of top line that starts in blue and goes into orange is sort of like a business as usual case of just what a business might expect to see its carbon footprint be if it didn't take any particularly aggressive action in reducing emissions. So that orange there at the top represents the sort of decrease in emissions that needs to occur just through changes in business practices. The green at the very bottom would be essentially carbon offsets or emissions reductions through carbon removals that then essentially offset the remaining emissions that a company still has even after it takes those mitigation actions. So the goal is to get to that dark blue line cutting down through the middle. That essentially gets to net zero when you look at the emissions that still do exist in a company's value chain by 2050 and the removals that it has achieved, or that it's investing in, I should say. Just a quick note that, so, you know, we basically talked about these last couple sections that are over closer to me, the GHG emissions and goals and targets, but these are part of the TCFD recommendations and the upcoming SEC disclosure rules. They do fit into a wider framework that also addresses climate risks, financial impacts associated with climate change to a business. And so, you know, this is something that's certainly making an increasing headway into regulatory frameworks. And then lastly, this time, you know, what I talked about is really on the other side of the screen. And at South Pole, we like to show this slide to clients just to sort of illustrate the climate journey. You know, at the end of the day, the footprinting and target setting is really just sort of the first step in terms of outlining what types of reductions are necessary and then how to go about implementing those reductions and engaging your key suppliers in order to achieve those. Great. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the other two panelists. Did want to take a quick second, I guess, just to see if there are any questions that would be useful to clarify. Otherwise, happy to keep going. Yes. No, I believe that it can be either. Yeah, so it's a really good question, and this is one that we face a lot actually at South Pole. Sometimes it's just a matter of company leadership being comfortable with that idea. They either see their key competitors committing to science-based targets, and perhaps those competitors do have good insights into their footprint, do have good insights into what mitigation potential is available through existing technologies or decisions that they can make. And our clients, their leadership just decides to go ahead and say, look, we don't know, we have no idea how we're going to achieve this, but we are going to go ahead and do it. I would say that's less usually you do see companies want to have a sense of their footprint, of their reduction potential before they do set a target. And yeah, I guess we'll talk a little bit more about that. Great.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Just by a quick show of hands, how many people are familiar with Prologis? Good. In a room, it can go either way, everyone or no one. So as director of ESG at Prologis, I tackle the daunting question of how do we decarbonize 1 billion square feet. Oh, clicker, thank you. There we go. 1 billion square feet of industrial real estate across 19 countries, across 5,000 customers who all have varying different operations types, data centers, warehouses, light manufacturing. So no one size fits all solution. But that also means because of that scale, we're positioned to have a really large impact in a sector that is ready for decarbonization. We know what a lot of the solutions are. So what does our footprint look like specifically? We are 99.9% scope 3. So most of our emissions are in our real estate portfolio. Um, and that beyond scope 1, 2, and 3, we also touch 60% of the world's emissions just by being in the business of supply chains. So collaboration with customers can lead to quite a bit of impact within our scope and beyond as well. So we want to take advantage of that. So the breakdown, 60% is energy related. And that's great news because we have control over that in our portfolio. We can put solar on the roof. We can procure offsite renewable energy. That piece is highly addressable. Another 30% is construction related, is embodied carbon. Those solutions are more nascent. Through pilots, we know we can reduce, or we have reduced it by about 50% from our standard construction, and we know we can go further. But there's a lot of innovation to be done there and a lot of work to be done to standardize and scale those solutions so that they're actually cost effective on a square footage basis. So to that end, we're working with a lot of different partners. We're part of the MIT Sustainability Consortium, which is looking at how do we get to zero emission concrete? How do we advance carbon sequestration or carbon capture in the materials production industry? How do we promote circular economy within the within building construction so that we're not reusing and creating virgin materials every time? So really excited for what's going to come in that space. So our milestones. So we have an approved science-based target today and have since 2018. We very quickly realized that we needed to be more ambitious. We initially set a 2-degree target, and now we've recently committed to the net zero standard, which is in line with a 1.5-degree pathway. We felt passionate that we wanted to have an aggressive timeline, given what I said earlier about a large portion of our footprint being energy related and being very controllable. So our CEO wanted to do 2030. We said, okay, maybe let's pump the brakes a little bit. So we went for 2040. But the compromise was, let's think about at least that 0.1% that is our scope 1 and 2, our offices, our fleet, and let's attack that as soon as possible. And so we do have a 2030 target for scope 1 and 2. And while we have sort of quantitative interim targets behind this, when we speak about it to investors, when we speak about it to customers, and then particularly when we're trying to mobilize employees, we like to talk about it in terms of the actions we're taking. So the biggest thing we're focused on immediately is 1 gigawatt of solar on all of our rooftops, which I think we're at about like 350 right now. And then carbon neutral construction by 2025, using offsets, and then over time, decreasing the amount of offsets we're using towards actual mitigation. So thinking through everything that Phil just talked about, how did we go about that process and how did we implement our science-based target? So any credible commitment has to start with a data-driven strategy. So luckily for us, we already had our act together in terms of our footprint. The challenge we had was access to energy data in our portfolio. So we have to deal with a lot of estimation and spend-based approaches, which you touched on as well. So we had to create the best picture that we could while also thinking about what are the initiatives we need to put into place to have better performance tracking and have better ability to go after targeted opportunities and hotspots. So balancing that imperfect data was a big piece of this. As we went through the alignment process, I already touched on the speed at which our CEO wanted to run, which is awesome, great problem to have. So I think making sure we took the time to talk to key doers throughout the organization who are going to lead these work streams and making sure they know what they're responsible and accountable for. And one of the things we found helpful was doing that on a one-on-two or one-on-one basis to kind of give a safe space to everyone to get up to speed on climate concepts, ask the questions they need to ask, and really dive in and have some repetition around that as well. For our commitment, we felt it was important to align to a standard, science-based targets. So we've committed to the net zero standard as of last June, to include all of our scopes and even be taking action beyond scope 1, 2, and 3. For example, on fleet electrification, our customers' fleets don't fall within our footprint today, but we still help them to electrify. That's actually a business opportunity for us. And as we do that, those emissions will come within our footprint. So it's actually a reverse incentive, but we've made the decision that, okay, well, this is the right thing to do. So we're not going to worry about the accounting necessarily. We'll figure that piece out. And then for mobilization, this was one of the biggest challenges. Right as we got through the alignment piece, we just got CEO approval. We announced a huge merger. And if you're familiar with greenhouse gas accounting, you're supposed to rebaseline and recalculate and restate your historical years. So we had a big decision moment over, are we going to wait to announce our commitment? Are we going to take the time to do that analysis before we move forward? And we decided to keep going against our current schedule because the actions were exactly the same. We were just getting more buildings that require the same things, just over a larger scope. So that was a little bit of a bump in the road that ended up not holding us back too much. A couple of other, I already went over some of the lessons learned, a couple more on the data side. Or on the analysis side, one thing that really helped us out was thinking about what do we have control over and what do we not. So the nature of our business being real estate, there's a lot that's in our customers' hands. So thinking through how are we going to promote that collaboration and motivate customers to want to decarbonize. And the great news about today is it doesn't take a lot of convincing. Ironically, scope 1 and 2 for us are difficult to control because we lease our offices from landlords. And so electrification is going to be a challenge. We'll have to do that together. So thinking through what do you control, what do you not control? And then also not forgetting about the long tail of little things you need to do. I think often in business, we get stuck in this 80-20 mindset because that's an effective way of thinking for most things. But when it comes to net zero, it's all about actual zero. And so thinking about, okay, well, how do I get that 0.1%, and making sure we're thinking it all the way through. I think those are all the main lessons learned that I wanted to cover. So I'll just leave with a quick maybe call to action. As I've mentioned, a big part of getting to zero for us is going to be collaborating with our suppliers, with our customers, and there's a long list of things we have to do with each of those groups. So encourage you to reach out to your networks. If you're part of Prologis' network, let's talk. We're ready to do this.
Great. Yeah, hopefully this works. Success. Thank you, Sam. Always hard to follow Sam, so do my best. A little bit of a scratchy voice. Apologies. So hi, everyone. Again, I'm Nina Preston. I'm with Ball Corporation, and I've been part of the Ball team for 3 years in my past life, environmental consulting. So all my background has been in greenhouse gas accounting. Happy to talk afterwards, fumble through some things together. But for some context for Ball, we're headquartered in Colorado, and we're a global organization, a Fortune 500 with 21,000 employees. And I think what most people may know Ball by is the Ball Mason jar. Not actually part of our business. That was where we began. We've sold it. It's kept the name. So for the picture of modern Ball, wanted to speak to our beverage packaging business, our aerosol packaging business, and our small but powerful aerospace business. And so a little bit disconnected, I think, to the strange eye, but it's mostly about metal. And I'll get into that as well as we start talking about our supply chain and how that impacts us. And so with that kind of metal in mind and with kind of the materiality that we have with our beverage packaging business, that's been our main focus and a main driver for our sustainability ambitions. And kind of thinking and processing what Sam said as well in regards to customer involvement. Our customers are pushing us. And so it's a little bit of a trade position, again, from a manufacturing side for beverage. And, you know, if our main customer is a Coca-Cola, their customer is you all. And so with the world demanding better packaging, Coca-Cola gets that pressure. That pressure falls upon us. And a big part of our lift and our level of effort comes from making sure our supply chain, who is a bauxite mine, ultimately has sustainability pressures. They're not visible to the consumer. They're not seeing those pressures, so they have to come from us. And so that's kind of where our ambition and our engagement comes from. So in speaking to our climate strategy, we know what our customers want, our investors want, and our stakeholders want from a sustainability perspective. And from packaging, I think, again, you can even see in the news or in the communities, we're looking for better options than what we have today. And so the great thing about aluminum is that it is infinitely recyclable. As long as we're recapturing it, it can be melted, remade into the same product, made into a different product, a bike, a car, a can. And so that's one of the great things about our product is that it can be zero waste as long as society is working with it. But that means engaging with consumers to recycle, implementing recycling across the globe. You know, there are better recycling rates in different countries. And so a big part of our supply chain management and lowering that carbon emissions actually comes from working beyond our walls and looking at that scope 3 piece and that community piece. And then, of course, for the carbon emissions piece, we have our scope 1 and 2, which make up about 8% of our portfolio, and 92% similarly to, I think, most organizations come from our supply chain. And for us, that's the metal procurement and that purchase goods and services bucket. As Philip mentioned, it's such a big bucket and has so much attention, even though it's just one of 15 listed for scope 3. And so kind of making that connection, when we're reducing our scope 1 and scope 2, we're owning our manufacturing facilities. We can apply renewable energy to that. We can innovate in our technology for thermal use to convert from thermal to electric, use alternative gases to try and lower that thermal footprint. And so those are the levers that are easier for Ball Corp, the 1 and 2. The harder piece, again, is that scope 3. And so the recycled content comes in to our big kind of goal perspective, because the more recycled metal we use, the less, or I guess the shorter our supply chain. From mining, smelting, refining, rolling to us, Ball, and then Coca-Cola, and then you. This piece gets shortened to just the remelting and recycling and rolling when we include, or when we prioritize recycled content. So that's a big part of kind of the vision that we have for Ball Corporation, is to have, I think, 90% recycled content in all of our packaging. So we shorten that primary aluminum, that kind of dirty or fresh out of the mine aluminum, to only 10% of our carbon footprint. Oh, I guess one piece to speak to that, sorry. We began with a science-based target. However, as everyone has kind of sped and learned, the level of ambition has changed so dramatically, and we see that with the world of climate. It's going to change probably every 2 to 3 years. Our goals get outdated pretty quick. And so that's where more recently we've decided to commit to net zero as well. And we haven't formally gone through the SBTI process because, as I'll say, kind of in talking through that, it's a really, really big commitment to make that actionable through SBTI. Having that third-party verification is really important, and we want to take it really seriously. And I think there's both a balance of we want to leap into it, we want to commit to it, but we want to know our pathway as well. And so that's something that we've heard from our leadership. There's a lot of unknowns, there's a lot of variables, and we want to connect to that and have something to speak to before we're making that commitment verified through the SBTI organization. Okay, so a little bit talking about our sustainability journey in regards to the SBTI. And so when you're thinking about process setting, the first thing we had to do was learn what an SBT was. What is a science-based target? Who is this SBTI and what are they asking us for? And so that was kind of step one for our team, was learning the language and being able to speak to it in a way that we could communicate to non-sustainability experts, which is always a challenge. And so once we had a better understanding of what that was, we looked at our customers and talked to our customers. Was that a priority for them? We want to be their sustainability partner. We want to be working with them to 2050, but what does their business look like in 2050? How do we continue to align? And so that's what brought us to ultimately the commitment and the alignment with the science-based target. So we have a scope 1 and scope 2 science-based target of a 55% absolute emissions reduction by 2030. And again, that absolute versus intensity piece, we knew was a priority to have that absolute reduction, because ultimately net zero would mean a flat zero. It's not an intensity zero, it's a flat zero. And then we're looking at our customers, and their scope 3 means us. And so that's where we also incorporate our scope 3 target, a 16% reduction, to make sure we're cascading that level of effort down. And so once we decided we're comfortable with it, let's do it, we went into the math and looked at the various pathways. And so when Ball first set its target and had it verified by the SBTI, I think in 2020, there were not sector-specific guidance. And I think that's one thing that's changed in the SBTI. There's now an aluminum guidance pending. And so when we had first developed the target, that wasn't part of an option for us. And so that's, again, we'll have to look at revisions and resubmitting our inventory to look at alliance with that methodology versus our current. And so as the pace of change happens, as the technology becomes more available, we'll have to revise our targets to align with SBTI. And so once all that math was done and we figured out a good pathway for us, our main job, I think, as sustainability personnel is sales, making the point to everyone else that it matters, and kind of the key doers, as you had said, and our key stakeholders. It's not a nice to have, it's part of your business decision making, and getting them on board, you have to learn their language as well. So what we ended up doing is hosting a climate summit for all of our key stakeholders to just teach them what scope 1, 2, and 3 meant. I think that's a big part of the education process and why it matters to them. So it was a lot of side conversations, in addition to kind of our support from our CEO, who had lots of love and leadership and ambition for sustainability, had similar, let's be zero now, and we have to talk them back to the process. You know, we don't want to greenwash, we don't want to falsify any commitments. And so because of that, we need the doers, we need the engineers, we need the operations managers. Procurement is a big ally for us, again, with the metal piece. And so in doing that, we had to host this climate summit to get everyone on board, to make the business case, and for them also to see the CEO clap and cheer. That's a very visible and powerful thing for an organization. And Ball is big and old, 150 years old. We take a lot of leadership from the top. And so just that kind of emblem of support was really, really powerful for us as an organization. And so in submitting the targets, kind of the next step was doing the paperwork. And I think a key maybe tip for you all submitting a target is to look at that submission form first, understand what data you need, understand the questions they're asking. It's pretty technical, and though an advanced organization, it's a Word doc and it's clumsy, and there's a lot of conversations that you'll have with the SBTI team in that submission process. And so I think, you know, commit 2 months, 3 months to filling out that verification form in your timing and having those conversations with the SBTI organization to understand your process. And then lastly, for the target revisions, I think we've all seen, again, the pace of change happen in climate science. When we first set our target or had our target approved, we had done so in 2018. And that's also when the IPCC announced that 2 degrees isn't good enough. We need 1.5. So we had to go through a revision process after committing to the SBTI to up our level of ambition to a 1.5 degree target. And then in addition, that target will change and require revisions every 5 years. That's also part of the goal setting. You are forced to resubmit every 5 years, just in case your business has changed, in case your boundaries have changed, if you've gone through an acquisition, if you've gone through a divestiture. And so it's keeping you honest. And it's a smart organization. SBTI is holding us accountable as much as they can. And so I think playing by their rules is really challenging, but also really helpful in keeping you accountable to their ambitions. I think those are all for my slides. But I wanted to talk about net zero in regards to kind of the future for Ball and how we're thinking about net zero. And so we haven't submitted our commitment through SBTI in part because in addition to emissions reductions, there's an innovation gap. And that's actually part of the requirement for SBTI. In addition to just doing the work and getting to zero, which is challenging, you have to contribute something to the greater world of sustainability so that by the time we get to 2040, and we're going to be stressing at 2040 as corporates to know what that difference is to get to zero, we'll need advanced technology. And we can't hope for it to be there at 2040. We have to work towards it. And so that's a really interesting piece of the commitment itself requires your investment beyond your walls, beyond your supply chain, into this nebulous thing of doing better for everyone. And so that's something that we're trying to understand from a company perspective, what makes sense for our customers, what makes sense for our supply chain. You know, if we want to pick a technology to totally innovate, who are we going to work with? How are we going to contribute to that value add at 2040? So that's a big kind of innovation gap that we're thinking through and working with. And again, I think most of our priorities has been in that metals world, in that procurement piece. And so decarbonizing that part of our supply chain is kind of step one for us, having those conversations with our suppliers, kind of communicating the urgency as well, and making sure our customers are aware that this piece of change might be slow. Metal processes are slow to change, and the technology is really, really expensive to innovate. And so that's one of the things that we're continuously having a conversation with. You know, we're close to our customers, but we're even closer to our suppliers because we have to be. And cascading that influence is one of the more challenging things we have to do, but it's also really interesting work. And it's a lot of education. So getting them to get science-based targets is a next step for us. Including that in contracts is the next step for us. Again, accountability beyond our walls to make sure progress is top to bottom. I think that's all. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
It seems like the profit opportunity for recycling, it's got to be so much less costly than mining bauxite out of the ground. Hello? So I'm just curious how you're getting after the circularity piece. And, you know, is there collaboration with other companies in the industry? Because that seems like, I know there's a lot of other companies who are trying to get after that, who have, you know, complex electronics. This seems like a really achievable opportunity. And so just curious how y'all are getting after that.
Yeah, great question. I wish I had more circularity folks with me to provide more insight. But, you know, my understanding is, again, there's a lot of profit in regards to scrap, and there's a lot of competition. It's not just cans, it's not just aerosol bottles, there's cars, there's bikes. Everyone who uses aluminum wants this scrap because everyone's being under pressure for that lower carbon footprint. And so we're largely focusing on kind of the municipal relationships to capture that scrap. But honestly, one of our bigger focuses is creating more scrap. I think the recycling rate in the US is 51%. And so there's tons and tons of metal that we want in landfill. And so one of our biggest priorities is getting that out of landfill into the facilities that we need to clean and recapture. So that recapture piece is harder than just, you know, kind of not throwing money at the problem, but purchasing the scrap that's available. The challenge is making more scrap available. So I'm not quite an answer to your question, but it's a two-part ambition for us is increase recycling rates globally as well as increasing recycled content. And we can't increase recycled content without increasing the recycled rates first. And that's behavior change, which is very slow unless we have legislation. So a big part of our kind of public affairs team, which is collaborating with legal and legislation, is influencing policy at the local level, at the global levels to provide better incentives for scrap collection. So there's, you know, deposit return schemes as an example where you, as the consumer, get a small cost back to you for returning that piece of metal. And so we're developing incentives. There's really successful examples in Europe that we're learning from. And again, from a global organization, we can look to Europe and see what does legislation look like? What does success look like? What does failure look like? How do we apply that to the US? How do we get the state of Texas to recycle? We don't know. We're going to work on it. It's a challenging one. Sorry, Texans here. Appreciate you. But there are truly just like islands and isolations just from an infrastructure perspective. And so how do we build recycling facilities? How do we introduce, you know, recycling trucks in communities? It's a really, really big network that we have to support. Yeah. Sure.
I just, for any of the panelists, and I realize it's probably different from company to company. I'm not here. But I'm just curious the interaction between firms that you have like a sustainability officer, between the sort of divide and roles between what the supply chain officer is doing and what the sustainability officer is doing and how that works.
Can you clarify it further a little bit?
I guess, you know, I'm an MBA student right now. I'm a veteran who got out like last year. And we, in our supply chain class, there's not a lot of talk of sustainability. However, we know that firms are setting these goals. And so I guess I'm trying to understand, you know, at at the table when you're making decisions and when you're trying to implement this, what is the domain of the supply chain officer, and what is the domain of the sustainability ESG lead?
I have a lot to say on this topic, so I'll keep it somewhat brief. In my former life, I was a strategy consultant at Accenture, and so I got to see that at a lot of different organizations. And what we were seeing in the last couple of years is that the chief supply chain officer was increasingly accountable for decarbonizing the supply chain, but often didn't know where to start, came from an operations background, was just getting up to speed and learning all of this stuff. And now fast forward a couple of years later, I'm seeing that a lot of people in those roles have a much more robust understanding of these concepts, which is awesome. Using Prologis as an example, we report into our chief operating officer. Prologis felt that it was important to have our ESG and sustainability team sort of front and center, high visibility, so that the rest of the business would understand how important these actions were. So we do have different teams, some focused on, I'd say the ESG team is more focused on what are we doing as Prologis internally for our own operations, and then we have a sustainability team that's more focused on the customer collaboration. And so that's kind of how we divide up responsibilities.
Yeah, I think that it certainly depends a lot on the relationship with individual suppliers. So if it's a company that has been investing in its suppliers, that has a really close relationship with where those impacts are occurring, we've seen some of our clients at South Pole directly incentivizing suppliers to reduce their emissions. And so that's really, going back to sort of the governance topic, that's really a situation where the sustainability officer is outlining priorities, identifying sort of key pathways, and then coming to the sourcing organization and saying, here's what we would like to do. And, let's make a case for getting budget to essentially incentivize mitigation interventions that reduce GHG emissions. For some other clients where, there's sort of either a number of different relationships with suppliers, or they don't necessarily feel that they're empowered to take that route, we're seeing a little bit more of a sort of like a total value framework, where you look at sort of what's the economic value, what's sort of the product quality value, and then like a sustainability value that we're getting from these suppliers. And how do we use sort of a combination of strategies, be they some incentives, be they some requirements, if we feel like we can do that with these suppliers, to really move them in the direction that we want them to go. But yeah, those are definitely really hard conversations. And I think those are some of the more challenging sort of gates that we arrive at along that climate journey with the clients that we work with.
Yeah, and I'll chime in also. Sorry, real quick. I know we have more questions. But for us, we have a sustainability team within our procurement organization, and that's a new thing, to be honest. And I would say kind of the evolution of where our sustainability team has evolved is pretty interesting. At first, we're part of the communications team. We're a nice story. And then we're part of the commercial team because, the Coca-Cola's liked that story and they wanted to learn more about it and use decisions based on our story. And so it became more of a business strategy from that point. And then now we're our own organization within the broader business, so that we're on a global, we have a CSO, a corporate sustainability officer. And so that's a first for us, where it has a global reach and where it's trying to accomplish all these things as an independent, strong arm. And I think you should always ask a sustainability person where they lie. Sometimes they're in legal, sometimes they're in different branches, and there's different powers you get from that. Legal has a lot of authority if you ask anyone, maybe the last person you want to talk to, but they're important and they have that pull. And so for us, getting a sustainability person in procurement was having a representative on the procurement side to say, I know you have these two options in front of you. Have you considered the carbon impact of this decision versus that one? And the penalty of using that one will be we're further away from our goal, and our CEO is going to look at you and say, that was your decision. And so just trying to educate them as well as kind of get your allies into those businesses so that it's not a sustainability decision, it's just a business decision. But it's a slow process. And again, that procurement representative or sustainability representative in procurement is a newer role.
Hi, thank you so much for all of this information. It's been so interesting. I'm curious, as part of your measurement architecture, if you look at increases in investor ratings, why or why not, and which investors specifically are most important to your business?
Yeah, I can say for Ball, we, and most, I think large corporates have to report to a variety of ESG, I guess, reporting systems. So CDP is one, GRI is one, DJSI is another. And so the investors and investor analysts are pulling the data from that, seeing your progress against the targets, the score you get from that, the grade you get from that to make their ESG portfolio. And you should, score a certain threshold to be considered part of that portfolio. And for us, we want to be part of that portfolio. We want to be the sustainability business for aluminum, for packaging. And so we care a lot about those investor ratings. We work hard to get an A in CDP, and it's a really important part of our decision making. And if we're looking to develop, the next step, do we want a biodiversity program? Do we want a water program? We look at what customers are asking, and we look at what investors are asking for. So they're definitely influencing our decision making.
A little bit of a two-part answer for me, the ratings and rankings, and then the investor interaction. So timely question, because we wrapped up a sustainability investor roadshow last week where we, not me, our chief sustainability officer, went proactively out on the road to talk about what we're doing, but then also understand what is the information that investors were looking for, and just what's top of mind. Part of that interaction is understanding what ratings and rankings do they find important. You can't do all of them. It's a lot of work. So picking which ones you think are most important to your business, most important to your stakeholders, and kind of going after those. And part of that too is which ones do you think have evaluation methodologies that are most holistic and meaningful in driving action as well.
Hi, thanks so much for your time. Shannon Fender. I'm with VF Corporation. I'm actually on the government affairs side. But I'm curious what role public policy plays in all of your world and how you're thinking about this issue.
It's driving the whole business case. No, I mean, there's several value drivers, but it's really helped accelerate our ability to get the business to pay attention. For example, in the EU, they're considering a PV mandate on all buildings greater than, I think it's 250 square meters. And so using that, we can then think about accelerating our on-site solar strategy. But without that, pace would have been a lot slower. So helps accelerate, and similar for the IRA, which I know everyone is still figuring out how it applies to your business, but it at a minimum shows more is coming from the US government, and this is going to be increasingly important.
Yeah, absolutely. And with a kind of big presence in Europe as well, we've had to keep up, and then we kind of pull our North America and South America business along second time. And so it's great to have someone else pushing us, because we do need that push, or we need that pull, and we're slow to change. Big old ship, I think, steering that takes a long time. So add a thruster and we'll be faster. And so that's one of the things we definitely lean on for our business decision making. And then we're also looking at policy again for that really micro level, working with the consumer, getting that recycling perspective is really important for us.
Yeah, I'd say that we see a mix of that. I'd say that there are some clients that we have that, given maybe operations in Europe, it's something that they're thinking about a lot. We have other clients that I'd say the private sector has really taken the torch and is sort of leading the charge, and frameworks. So this is where at the moment I'm doing most of my work in the ag and food space, and so in that industry, the fact that the supply chain activities actually sequester carbon are providing sort of these opportunities to then demonstrate what that impact is, and allowing companies to sort of monetize that or seek to. So yeah, I would say that from sort of my experience, that it's certainly variable, but I think that even within those organizations, there is an anticipation that when you're looking out to a 2050 sort of timeline, that there will be policy at some point that will be a key motivating factor. So it's still certainly part of the discussion across sort of the whole spectrum of businesses, but the short term motivations are maybe a little bit more varied.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Ferrante with Southwest Airlines, and I work with Southwest Business. And my question is kind of from a supplier side. So my role is to actually help companies reach those Scope 3 goals. And as we talked about, a lot of these are pretty aggressive. Southwest Airlines has a net zero goal for 2050. And so part of my job is to go into companies and find how I can support their goals. So I've been working with both Ball and Prologis, and we work on like sustainable aviation fuel and offsetting carbon. And so I'd like to kind of understand just from your guys' perspective, and even Phil, if you have, insights on what were you looking for from your suppliers, whether it be a carbon offset cost, or whether it be investment into sustainable aviation fuel, SAF? What were you guys looking for in the near future from your suppliers?
That's a tough one for that industry. And I think that some of as we spoke to a little bit, there's still also some industry specific frameworks that are being developed. And I believe that aviation is one of those where there's still sort of ongoing discussions. But I think in the near term, it's for there to be sort of strategy and targets in place, right? So that's sort of the beauty of the science-based targets framework, is that those targets stack up across each other on the value chain and everyone's sort of pulling in the same direction. Outside of that, at this point, demonstration of sort of piloting of technologies that can actually deliver on that type of goal, from my perspective, would be really high up on the list. Like, it's understandable and sort of, just realistic that we're not going to be there quite yet, and that scaling is going to be a huge obstacle. But the sort of piloting of the technologies that are necessary to get there is a key step, and a lot of the leaders that I see in the space, that's where they're sort of focusing at this moment of time.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with all of that. So just to reiterate, I think in addition to offsetting, investment innovation to figure out what are the new solutions that are going to get us to zero. So you talked about sustainable aviation fuels, and then also what's next after that. But also on top of that, engagement to what do you need from us to help accelerate progress as well, and what's the role that we can play?
Yeah, and I'd say from our perspective, business travel, which is kind of our big aviation side, besides our aerospace, which is jet fuel. So I truly don't know if that's the same type of fuel. I'm deeply sorry, but going into outer space versus flying across the US, who knows? You'll know. So for us, again, the materiality of that slice of our scope 3 is so small. It hasn't been a priority, but again, we need to look at that 0.1% and understand what that is. And I think for us, we have to change on our side the decision making. So we have like a procurement tool, for example, that will buy all of your flights. How do we prioritize airlines or institutions that are offsetting those flights? How do we embed that into the decision making for the user on our side to make it easier to achieve our goals? And I think that's maybe a gap in my understanding, and just understanding, unfortunately, how do we make this easy for us to use you and align with those kind of third parties that may be selecting in or out of certain flights based on just cheapness, or what are those variables that they're considering?
Gases, climate change. Either with us or you're against us. And if you're sort of on the side where you maybe are asking questions and saying, well, how do we do this when the technology is not completely there right now, or reasonable questions, that then sometimes you get judged and being pushed away. And I see that so often in this arena, that it makes it a challenge to build the coalitions you need to really attack this challenge.
Yeah, a complex and interesting question. I think for us, the thinking about how do we commit within a space where there's still things to be figured out is really challenging. And the thing that I keep coming back to, and that our CEO is really committed to, is looking at it through the lens of, okay, what if we just stripped everything away? What is the right thing to do? And then coming back to, okay, how do we overlay the business drivers on top of that? So for example, I referenced like the EV, the fleet electrification example. So thinking about it from that lens helps, because then if you do get that criticism of, okay, well, we don't have this figured out. How are you talking about this? What, this isn't credible. You've done all you can and to illustrate that commitment and you know that you're actually taking action. So I guess it's kind of putting action behind words and then tuning out the noise where you can't do anything about it. The other piece of that is the competition collaboration kind of pull is difficult to navigate. And I think in my role, I lean a lot more towards collaboration being on the ESG team. But I think it's getting comfortable with having working groups and environments where, sure, maybe you're not sharing competitive information, but you're very open about the approaches you're already taking, and willing to have those conversations in favor of accelerating innovation for the whole industry, not being afraid to bring the whole industry with you versus your own competitive advantage.
Yeah, and I think the elephant in the room is just data transparency. It's so hard to get comfortable with that. We are asking for it and we're not comfortable with it. We're not saying the right things, but we're asking for so much more from our our suppliers than what we would provide to our customers. And that's, we're going to have to evolve, and we're part of several working groups to, NDA signed, protections in place, just so that we can have those conversations. And I would say, the sustainability teams of each side are interested in that collaboration. And we're not the ones that are saying no to that data. It's kind of the legal influence, the corporate influence, the competitive influence that's stopping us there. But again, that collaboration piece is so important. And I think we'll be forced to have more and more data transparency, either by regulations or even just by our contractual agreements. We're trying to incorporate into our contracts with suppliers, again, aluminum, reporting their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions to us. And then we'll be asking for their scope 3, and then we'll be asking for them to verify those. And so it's kind of a chain of influence that we're incorporating via contracts, at least through that supply chain. And for customers, it's more of a, again, less contractual or via flexibility. So that's where we're kind of making those compromises and looking together. And then a challenging thing, I'm not sure if you face, but when you're trying to develop, an energy portfolio for a product, a carbon portfolio for a customer, how do you slice and dice it relevant to them? Is that an inaccurate reflection of the company overall? And so it's some of the things, where we're slicing and dicing data, we don't want to be untruthful, but again, true to their product. So it's just a complexity and transparency.
I'll add more that I think there's different roles for different companies to play. As a bigger company, Prologis feels, we have to be out ahead and bearing some of the risk of innovation. And so for other companies who are smaller, it's going to make sense to not be the first to do things. And so knowing within your business strategy, how can you use that to drive the most impact, having the impact lead first. And so like, if you are a big company, take on some risk, bear the cost of innovation. And like I said earlier, don't be afraid to bring the industry along with you.
I guess one small additional thought, if you're a big company, you also, if you're going to ask this of your suppliers, you have to educate them. There's a lot of, our customers who are huge or have just invested a lot of time, money, resources in consulting support and other support to educate their suppliers on what scope 1 and scope 2 is. If you're going to ask them to reduce it, they have to calculate it. They don't know where that is. It's up to you to educate them because you're doing that ask.
All right, if we could thank Phil, Samantha, and Nina for their time. And up next, we have our lunch buffet. It is right outside of this room, and then you can make your way back into the main space where there will be table starter conversations for you all to get to know each other. Don't forget that there is a headshot photographer right out there that you all can take advantage of. And the next sessions start at 1:15. And they are twice as nice, amplifying impact through partnerships in Cripple Creek Ream 2, CSR and DEI in Cripple Creek Room 1, and integrating CSR and ESG in the ballroom. So see you all soon and enjoy lunch.